On the 4th of July 1946, a hill near Gdańsk turned into a human stadium. 200,000 people gathered to watch a row of gallows. No courtroom silence, no closed doors, no private ending. Open trucks rolled in. Bound prisoners stood on the flatbeds, hands tied, legs bound, surrounded by guards. Then the signal came. The trucks drove forward, and the condemned dropped one by one, hanging in front of a crowd that came to see an ending. Among the executed were officials from the Stutthof concentration camp system, including the commandant and 10 loyal staff. And 5 of the executed were women, all under 25 years of age. So the question is not whether they were guilty. The question is this: what made young women choose work inside a Nazi concentration camp? What did they do there? And how were they hunted down and executed in public less than 2 years later? To understand that hill outside Gdańsk, you have to understand Stutthof. Stutthof was not a camp most people in the West grew up hearing about first. It was in occupied Poland, near the old Danzig region, close to the Baltic coast, surrounded by water routes that later made transport and evacuation easier. It began operating shortly after the invasion of Poland. At first, it was set up to hold Poles deemed politically suspect, but terror arrived fast. Early on, prisoners were forced into brutal tasks tied to mass killing outside the camp, digging graves, handling bodies, living with the knowledge that the SS intended witnesses to disappear. For a time, the camp functioned as internment. Then it shifted. By late 1941, it was pushed into labor education, forced labor under police control. And after senior SS inspection in early 1942, it was formally categorized as a concentration camp. The transformation that mattered most came later. By 1944, Stutthof expanded rapidly. More subcamps, more prisoners, more security. Barbed wire was replaced with electrified fencing. Ukrainian auxiliaries were brought in to support the SS crew. A women's camp section was added, and dozens of German women were recruited into the guard system. This is where the story turns darker than people expect. Because the public image of Nazi womanhood was domestic, children, kitchen, church, but war demanded labor. So the regime trained girls for obedience and duty from a young age through organizations like the League of German Girls. It pushed the message that service to the state was virtue. And as men went to combat roles, women were pulled into supporting structures, communications, offices, administration. But a smaller group went into the camps. And inside a camp, the job was not support, it was control. Female guards operated within a strict hierarchy of ranks and roles. Many joined young, ambitious, ideologically committed, or simply drawn to steady pay, status and authority. And that authority was immediate. In Stutthof, guards had something most young people never experience: power with almost no consequences. You could punish with a whip. You could strike someone who couldn't fight back. You could decide who was fit for labor and who was marked as disposable. And the system trained them to believe the victims were less than human. So cruelty became routine, not shocking. Your source describes several women whose names later ended at the gallows. Ewa Paradis is described as arriving for training in the late phase of the war and quickly moving into direct control of women prisoners. Testimony described her using beatings as daily practice, hitting faces and bodies during roll calls, pouring cold water over naked women in winter, treating weakness as a reason to punish harder. Her reputation for cruelty made her useful. Elizabeth Becker is described as young and local to the region, working within the Stutthof system and tied to decisions during evacuation by sea, where transport lists and signatures meant the difference between survival and death. In the camp world, paperwork isn't neutral, it is a weapon. Jenny Wanda Bachmann, described as Mad Jenny and the Beautiful Spectre, became infamous for the contrast, youth and appearance paired with brutality. Your source describes testimony that she beat prisoners, sometimes to death, and sent the weak, including women and children, to the gas chamber process. Even in custody, she behaved as if nothing mattered. Wanda Clough is described as less known but relentless, organizing repeated roll calls, whipping women as they exited barracks, leaving bodies covered in bruises, driving prisoners into desperate choices like jumping from windows to avoid the lash, only to be injured worse. Gerda Steinhoff is described as rising quickly into authority, block leader, senior guard, known for selections and sadistic abuse. In court, she tried to describe herself as a bureaucratic worker, distant from violence, but the story says too many prisoners survived to contradict her. Now push the timeline forward. In the summer of 1944, as Soviet forces surged west, Jews were removed from ghettos in the region and sent to Stutthof. Many arrived on death marches, forced walks that killed through hunger, exposure, and gunfire. Stutthof's prisoner population exploded. The system tightened, and violence became more systematic. Then the war turned on the perpetrators. In early 1945, evacuations began. The camp system started moving prisoners again, by foot and then by sea, trying to stay ahead of the Soviet advance. Your source describes forced marches that reversed direction, transports that ended in mass death, and sea evacuations where prisoners were pushed into the water and shot, or packed onto boats where many died before reaching shore. Here is why this matters for what happens later. Evacuation creates evidence, orders, lists, signatures, witnesses, survivors. When the war ended, Stutthof did not simply dissolve into chaos. Soviet authorities photographed camp facilities and documented signs of destruction attempts, including efforts to demolish the gas chamber. Those images, along with survivor testimony, became tools for prosecution. And then the hunt began. Some guards tried to return to normal life. Some hid. Some were caught at stations or ports while trying to leave. Your source describes Bachmann being captured at a train station and others being arrested in the months after the surrender. Then came the trials. Not just moral condemnation, legal condemnation. Witnesses described what these women had done: beatings, selections, cruelty as routine, participation in a system where prisoners were treated as disposable. And finally, the decision that created one of the most shocking post-war scenes in Poland: a public execution. On the 4th of July 1946, 200,000 people gathered near Gdańsk. Gallows were erected. Press photographers recorded the event. The authorities expected a controlled procedure, but the crowd wanted a moment. Your source describes the condemned being transported on open trucks, not hooded, with short drops that meant strangulation rather than a clean break. It describes improvised ropes made from plant fibers because proper ropes were not available. It describes resistance, struggling, fighting before the nooses tightened. And it describes the atmosphere turning dangerous, stones thrown, warning shots fired into the air. The city feared a mob lynching. People climbed trees and roofs to see. Then one detail exposes how brutal this was as a public spectacle. A truck would not start. A condemned woman stood under the noose, alive, while the crowd reacted with frustration because the machine of death had stalled. When the trucks finally moved, the bodies swung in the open air, and the crowd surged forward, trying to tear off buttons, cloth, pieces of rope, souvenirs from a death they believed was justice. The authorities had to take bodies down quickly to restore control. This was not justice as closure, it was justice as release, raw, public, and irreversible. The executed included the camp commandant and 10 officials, and among them were 5 young women under 25, women who had stepped into a system that rewarded cruelty, learned to punish without fear, and believed the end of the war would let them vanish into the noise. They were wrong, because Stutthof left survivors, because evacuation left documents, Because investigators, authorities and witnesses hunted names, faces, signatures and built cases. So that hill near Gdańsk became the final stage. Not because the world wanted symbolism, but because the post-war state wanted a warning that camp crimes would not be buried with the Reich, that youth would not excuse brutality, and that a uniform would not erase responsibility. On the 4th of July 1946, the trucks drove forward, and 5 young women who once enforced terror in the Stutthof system dropped into the air, hanging in front of 200,000 witnesses. That is what Stutthof became at the end, a camp built on control, and an ending defined by a rope.